Clean it properly, old lady. I can still see my reflection in there, and trust me, looking at your face is not something I enjoy." He held out his shoe, his actual shoe, removed from his foot, and dropped it on my desk in front of 30 employees. And I cleaned it. I picked up that shoe, I found a cloth, and I polished it until it shone. I kept my eyes down. I kept my face still. I let him laugh. What Leo didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the building we were standing in, I built it. The company logo on the wall behind him, I designed it on a napkin in 1987. The paycheck he cashed every Friday with such entitled satisfaction, it came from me. My name is Martha Calloway. I am 65 years old. I've been called a visionary, a disruptor, a pioneer. Forbes listed me among the 20 most powerful women in global business 3 years running. I have shaken hands with presidents, negotiated contracts on 5 continents, and built a logistics empire from a single second-hand delivery van and a dream so stubborn it refused to die. And on a Tuesday morning in October, I was cleaning a 25-year-old boy's shoe while he laughed at me. This is the story of how I let him, and this is the story of what happened next. Udodo, you have to understand where I came from before you can understand why I did what I did. I wasn't born into money. I wasn't born into connections or legacy, or any of the things that Leo took for granted before he could even walk. I was born in a small town in rural Ohio, the youngest of 4 children, to a father who drove a truck 6 days a week, and a mother who stretched every dollar like it was made of elastic. We weren't poor in the way that breaks people, but we were the kind of poor that teaches you, that burns lessons into your bones that you never forget. I watched my father come home exhausted every night. I watched him be passed over for promotions by men half as competent who simply knew the right people. I watched my mother work a second job cleaning offices after my brother got sick, and I watched her do it without a single word of complaint, because that was the kind of woman she was. Strong in a way that didn't need an audience. I swore, very young, that I would build something. I didn't know what. I just knew it would be mine. I started Calloway Logistics in 1987 with $2,200, a van I bought from a salvage auction, and a business plan I wrote by hand on legal paper. I was 27 years old. Every bank I approached said no. Every investor I pitched looked at me, a young woman with calloused hands and a second-hand blazer, and saw a liability. One man, I still remember him, silver-haired and condescending, leaned back in his leather chair and told me, and I'm quoting directly, "Logistics is not a woman's industry, sweetheart. Go home and think of something more suitable." I used that. I folded it up and I carried it with me like fuel. The first 3 years nearly destroyed me. I slept 4 hours a night. I drove routes myself. I handled customer service from a flip phone while simultaneously negotiating supplier contracts. There were months I didn't pay myself, so I could make payroll for the 2 employees I had. There was one winter, I've never told this story publicly, where I ate peanut butter sandwiches for 11 days straight because I'd reinvested everything into a new contract that hadn't paid out yet. But it paid out. And then the next one paid out. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, Calloway Logistics grew. By 1995, we had 12 regional offices. By 2003, we were operating internationally. Today, Calloway Logistics employs over 40,000 people across 22 countries. We move freight, manage supply chains, and connect businesses to their customers in ways that keep the global economy breathing. I am proud of what I built. I am proud in the deep, quiet way that only comes from having genuinely earned something. But here's the thing about building an empire. Eventually, it gets big enough that you can't see all of it. You hire regional managers. You trust your structure. You rely on the people beneath you to carry the culture you created, the values you fought for, down to the ground level, where the real work happens. And sometimes, those people let you down. The reports started coming in about 18 months ago. Subtle at first. An anonymous complaint through our HR portal about a hostile environment at the Cincinnati regional office. A resignation letter that mentioned management style in vague but troubling terms. Then another resignation. Then 3 more in quick succession. I asked my chief of people operations, a sharp woman named Diane, to look into it. What she found disturbed me. The Cincinnati office had been placed under the management of Richard Hargrove, a competent but politically savvy man who'd been with the company for 12 years. Richard had recently brought his son, Leo Hargrove, on as a strategic operations associate, a title Richard had essentially invented and inserted into the org chart without proper approval. Leo had no logistics experience. He had an MBA from a middling program and the absolute unshakable confidence of someone who had never been told no in his life. Within 8 months of Leo's arrival, the Cincinnati office had seen a 34% increase in voluntary turnover. Productivity metrics were down. Client satisfaction scores had slipped, and the nature of the anonymous complaints had shifted. They were no longer vague. Words like humiliation, harassment, and hostile appeared with increasing frequency. Several complaints specifically mentioned age-based discrimination. Older employees reported being sidelined, mocked, and in several cases assigned tasks deliberately beneath their qualifications as a form of punishment for speaking up. I read every single complaint. I read them at night, at my desk, with a cup of tea going cold beside me. And somewhere around the 15th account, a woman named Sandra, 58 years old, 21-year company veteran, who described being told by Leo that she was a dinosaur who should have retired already. Something settled in me. A cold, clear, absolutely certain resolve. I could send an investigation team. I could have HR conduct formal interviews. I could do this the way the org chart said it should be done. And Leo and Richard would lawyer up and smooth talk, and the truth would get buried under process and procedure and carefully worded corporate language. Or I could go see it myself. I've gone undercover before, twice in the early days when I suspected a warehouse manager was padding invoices. Both times, I learned more in a week on the floor than 6 months of formal audit had revealed. There's something about being invisible, about being dismissed, that lets you see everything. And I knew exactly what disguise to use. An elderly woman applying for an intern position. I would be the least threatening, most dismissible person in that building. Nobody watches the old lady who struggles with the printer. Nobody censors themselves around someone they've already decided doesn't matter. I talked to Diane. I talked to our legal team. I talked to Marcus, my head of security, who looked at me with genuine alarm and said, "Martha, you want to go undercover as an intern?" You? You're on the cover of Fortune magazine." "That was 3 years ago," I said, "and nobody in Cincinnati reads Fortune magazine." He didn't find that as reassuring as I intended. We built the cover carefully. A temporary staffing agency we'd worked with before agreed to place me under an assumed name. Margaret Collins, 65, recently retired from a clerical career, looking to stay active and contribute. We aged my resume appropriately. We made sure my references were airtight. I traded my tailored suits for elastic waist trousers, sensible shoes, and reading glasses I didn't need. I practiced walking slowly. My assistant Julia, who has worked for me for 11 years and knows me better than almost anyone, watched me practice my cover for an afternoon, and then said, very carefully, "Martha, are you sure about this?" "Absolutely not," I said. "Book the hotel." I arrived in Cincinnati on a Sunday evening. I checked into a modest hotel under my cover name. I ate dinner alone at a diner 2 blocks away, a patty melt and a slice of pie, and I sat there in my sensible clothes and my unnecessary glasses, and I thought about my father, about those long truck routes, about the way certain people had treated him, as though his labor was owed to them, as though his dignity was optional. I thought about Sandra and her 21 years and being called a dinosaur. Monday morning, first day. The Cincinnati office occupied the 3rd floor of a glass and steel building near the river. It was a good space, well designed, with an open floor plan and high ceilings. I recognized the furniture because I'd approved the budget for this office's renovation 4 years ago. Seeing it now from ground level, as someone who was supposed to be grateful to be there at all, felt strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. The receptionist who greeted me was a young woman named Priya, and she was kind immediately. She had warm eyes and a practiced professional calm, and she gave me a visitor badge and a tour with genuine patience. I liked her right away. She showed me to a workstation near the back of the floor, a little isolated, not in the main flow of activity, clearly a spot that had been set up without much thought. She apologized for it, which told me that she had thoughts about where I'd been placed. "Don't worry," I told her, shuffling a little. "I'm just happy to be useful." She gave me a look I couldn't quite read, and then she squeezed my arm gently and went back to her desk. I had been at my workstation for approximately 40 minutes, getting oriented, when I heard him. You know how some voices carry? Not just in volume, but in quality, in the specific frequency of someone who has never once in their life wondered whether they were welcome in a room? That was Leo's voice, loud and loose and completely at home in its own arrogance. "Okay, people, let's get moving. It's not Sunday anymore." He walked through the floor like he owned it, which, of course, he thought he did. Leo Hargrove was, objectively speaking, a physically attractive young man, tall, well-dressed, the kind of effortless grooming that comes from money and time. He looked like a catalog model playing at being a businessman. He had his father's jaw, and, I would come to understand, absolutely none of his father's competence, which, given Richard's mediocrity, was really saying something. He didn't notice me at first, which was precisely the point. The morning passed quietly. I was given a stack of data entry tasks, truly basic work, reconciling delivery records against invoices, the kind of thing a competent person could do in their sleep. I did it methodically, I asked a few carefully calibrated, confused elderly women. Questions of the person at the nearest workstation, a tired-looking man named Gerald, who answered with patient politeness. I smiled vaguely at my screen. I was, by all appearances, a harmless, slightly slow older woman, doing harmless, slightly slow work. At around 11 o'clock, Leo noticed me. I saw it happen. He was crossing the floor, coffee in hand, laughing at something on his phone, and then his eyes caught me, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of amused contempt, like he'd found something unexpectedly ridiculous. He walked over. "You're the intern?" he said. Not a warm greeting, a verdict. "That's right," I said, looking up with what I hoped was appropriate deference. Margaret Collins. How old are you?" The directness of it, in a professional environment. Just, "How old are you?" as though he were asking about a piece of furniture. 65, I said. He made a sound. Not quite a laugh, but in the family of one. "Huh." He looked at my workstation, at my screen, at the reading glasses I was wearing. "Well, Margaret, just try not to slow us down, okay? We run a pretty fast operation here." "Of course," I said. "I'll do my best." He walked away, and I held very still, and I breathed, and I thought, document this. Remember this. Hold it. That was day 1. Hour 3. It got worse. Of course it got worse. With people like Leo, it always escalates, because cruelty unchecked is cruelty that grows. By Wednesday of the first week, he had started calling me Grandma. Not to my face directly. Never directly. Because even bullies have a certain animal instinct for legal exposure. But in that middle-distance way, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Has anyone checked on Grandma? Make sure she hasn't wandered off." The people around him would laugh, because laughter was a survival mechanism in his office, not a genuine response. I documented it. Every instance. I had a small notebook. And yes, I used a paper notebook because I am 65 years old and I'm allowed. And I wrote down dates, times, exact words, and names of witnesses. I wrote in the smallest handwriting I could manage, so nobody would think twice about an old woman scribbling notes. By the end of week 1, I had 7 pages. I also started to understand the office dynamics more clearly. There was a core group of young employees, mostly Leo's hires, who functioned as a kind of court around him, laughing at his jokes, amplifying his opinions, looking to him for cues about who mattered and who didn't. And then there was everyone else, the longer-tenured employees, the middle-aged ones, the ones who'd been there through 3 or 4 management transitions and had survived by keeping their heads down and their output steady. Leo treated these 2 groups as though they existed in different moral universes. His favorites got praise, flexibility, and visible investment. Everyone else got managed with something between indifference and contempt. The older workers, and there were several, including Gerald, and a remarkable woman named Diane W., not my Diane, who had been with Calloway for 16 years, were treated as obstacles, as problems to be solved or endured. I watched Leo interrupt Diane W. in a meeting 3 times in 40 minutes. I watched him dismiss a proposal she'd spent clearly considerable time preparing with a single word: outdated. I watched her face as she absorbed it, the microscopic tightening around her eyes, the controlled breath, and I recognized it. It was the face of someone who has learned to absorb insults professionally, to convert them to fuel or simply to endure them. It made me furious in a way I had to work very hard to keep below the surface. In the second week, the tasks assigned to me began to change. The data entry work dried up and was replaced by things that felt increasingly deliberate. I was asked to reorganize the supply closet, not because it needed it, but because Leo pointed at it one afternoon and said, "Margaret, since you've got time on your hands." I was asked to reprint a large stack of documents that had already been printed correctly, seemingly for no reason. I was dispatched to pick up Leo's lunch order 3 times in a single week, which was not, I assure you, in any job description I had agreed to. None of it bothered me the way Leo intended it to. I've worked harder jobs than office errand girl. I once drove a delivery route through a blizzard for 14 hours because my driver called in sick and the client needed the shipment. Fetching a sandwich is not beneath me. What bothered me, what genuinely tested my composure, was watching him do it to others. There was a man named Robert, 61 years old, who had been a logistics coordinator at Calloway for 9 years. Robert was sharp, quiet, and extraordinarily good at his job. I could see it in the way he worked, the speed and precision of his judgments, the way younger employees quietly came to him with questions when Leo wasn't looking. He knew the systems, the vendors, the clients. He was exactly the kind of institutional knowledge that takes a decade to build and an afternoon to destroy if you're careless. Leo was careless on a Tuesday. He called Robert into a meeting in the glass-walled conference room, the fishbowl, people called it, because everyone on the floor could see in. And he proceeded to dress Robert down over a logistics report that, from what I could see, and subsequently confirmed, had been correct. Leo had misread it. This happened visibly in front of the floor, with the conference room door partially open so the sound carried. I heard the words, incompetent, embarrassing, and I don't know how you've kept this job for 9 years, but that ends now, before the door was finally pushed shut. Robert walked out of that meeting 15 minutes later, with his face completely controlled, and sat down at his desk and continued working. Because that's what people do. They absorb it and they continue. Because they have mortgages and families, and because dignity, when it's been attacked enough times, learns to operate underground. I went to the bathroom after that and stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. Not yet, I told my reflection. Not yet. The shoe incident happened on a Thursday in my 3rd week, which is where I started this story, and I want to tell you all of it now. Leo had come in that morning in a mood. I'd learned later, from Priya, who heard more than anyone realized, that he'd gotten a difficult call from a client the night before. A client who had specifically requested to escalate their complaint beyond the regional office. The call had apparently not gone well. Leo in a bad mood was like weather. You could feel it coming. The floor changed, got quieter, more careful. People found reasons to look busy, to be on calls, to not be in his path. I was at my workstation when he walked past, and I had the misfortune of my chair rolling back slightly as he passed. Just a small movement, not close to him, but enough that he stopped. He looked at me. He looked at my desk, and then he looked down at his shoes, and then he looked at me again, and I watched him decide something. He sat down in the empty chair across from my desk with the studied casualness of someone who knows exactly how much power they hold. He crossed one leg over the other, reached down, and removed his right shoe. "These got muddy on the way in," he said. "There's a cloth in the supply closet. Clean them." The floor had gotten very quiet. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't just anger, though there was anger. It was something older and deeper. It was the memory of every story I'd ever heard of someone diminished for sport, of my father being talked past, of the women in my early career who'd been handed coffee orders instead of speaking roles. It was recognition. The particular sick recognition of seeing something you thought belonged to another era, still alive and comfortable in the present day. I looked at him for a moment. Just one moment, where I held his eyes, and I felt very clearly who I was, and who he was, and how completely wrong this was. And then I looked down, and I said, "Of course." I got the cloth. I polished the shoe. I handed it back. He made a comment. "Clean it properly, old lady. I can still see my reflection in there." And the room laughed. That survival laugh, and he took his shoe and left. I went back to my desk. I opened my notebook. I wrote down every word, the time, the date, the number of people present. I counted. There were 31 people within visible or audible range of what had just happened. I gave myself exactly 30 seconds to feel it. The humiliation, the controlled fury, the grief of it, honestly. Because I did grieve a little in those 30 seconds. For every person who had ever sat in a chair like mine, with no notebook and no endgame. And then I closed the notebook, straightened my back, and went back to work. If you're watching this story and you're feeling something right now, if you're thinking about a time when someone made you feel small, when someone used their position to diminish you and walked away laughing, I see you. This channel exists for stories like this one. Stories about people who endured, who held on, who kept their dignity intact, even when everything around them was designed to take it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Every week we bring you stories of justice, of resilience, of the moment when the tables turn. Hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss what comes next. The company meeting was announced at the end of week 3. In the internal messaging system, it was described as a quarterly performance and culture alignment session. Leo's language, which managed to be both bloated and vague in the specific way of people who've read half a business book. Attendance was mandatory. It was scheduled for the main conference floor, with seats arranged theater style, facing a presentation screen and a podium. I knew what it actually was because Priya, careful, watchful Priya, had told me in a low voice while we were both in the kitchen that Leo had been preparing examples for the meeting. Examples of underperformance, of people who were dragging the team down. She'd heard him talking about it with one of his deputies, laughing about how he was finally going to clean house. She looked at me when she told me this, with an expression I couldn't fully parse. Something between warning and apology. "I'll be fine," I told her. She didn't look convinced. The morning of the meeting arrived. I wore my usual outfit, elastic waist trousers, a soft blue cardigan that Julia had selected because it read as the sartorial equivalent of non-threatening. I had my notebook in my bag. I also had something else in my bag, but we'll get to that. The floor filled up. All 43 regional staff settled into their seats with the particular collective body language of people who have been called to a mandatory meeting by someone they are afraid of. You learn to read rooms when you spend decades in business. This room was tight, braced. Leo walked in 10 minutes late. Deliberately, I was certain. Wearing a suit that cost more than some of these people made in a month. He had a presentation clicker in his hand, and the specific energy of someone who has been looking forward to this. "Good morning," he said. And it wasn't really a greeting. It was an opening statement. "I'm going to be honest with you today, because I believe honesty is a value this office has been missing." He clicked to his first slide. For the next 20 minutes, he walked through what he framed as a performance audit of the office. Some of it was legitimate business content, metrics, targets, process observations. But woven through it, with increasing frequency, were pointed references to specific employees, named or obviously identifiable, whose work he characterized in terms ranging from insufficient to, frankly, an embarrassment to the Calloway brand. Robert was mentioned by name. His report, the one Leo had misread, was displayed on the screen as an example of outdated analytical thinking. I watched Robert's face, and I watched him breathe. Diane W. was referenced as an example of resistance to innovation, which appeared to mean that she had pushed back on one of Leo's process changes by citing data that showed it would slow delivery times. She had been right. The data supported her. Leo had overridden her anyway, and now he was presenting her objection as a character flaw. He talked for several more minutes, and the room got progressively heavier, and then he clicked to a slide that said, in large font, "The cost of low performers," and he looked directly at me. "And then there's Margaret," he said. He said it conversationally, almost warmly, the warmth of someone about to land a punch. "Margaret has been with us for about 3 weeks now, as part of an intern initiative I want to be honest with you about. It was a mistake." He smiled at the room. "I think we all knew from day one that this particular placement wasn't going to work out. Some people," and here he paused for effect, "are simply past the point where they can contribute meaningfully to a fast-moving, high-performance environment. That's not a criticism. That's just reality." A few people laughed. Not many. The ones who did looked immediately uncomfortable with themselves. "I've prepared a formal release of service for Margaret, which she'll sign today." He picked up a folder from the table beside him. "We thank her for her time." He held the folder out toward me. The room was very still. I looked at the folder, and then I reached into my bag. Not for the notebook. I want to pause here and tell you something that I've thought about many times since. The moment when you decide to stop enduring and start acting, there is a quality to it, unlike any other moment I know. It's not dramatic, actually. There's no surge of adrenaline, no cinematic swelling of music. It's quiet. It's like a door opening. I had planned to wait 1 more week. I had planned to gather a few more documented incidents, build a more complete picture, do this through proper channels with maximum legal protection. That was the plan. But I looked at Robert. I looked at Diane W. I thought about the 31 people who had watched Leo hold out his shoe. And I thought, enough. I reached into my bag and I removed an envelope. I stood up. Now, here is something I have learned about presence over 40 years in business. You don't need to perform authority if you actually have it. You don't need to raise your voice or take a wide stance or do any of the things Leo had been doing all morning. You simply need to be certain. and I was the most certain I had been in years. I walked to the front of the room. Leo watched me come with an expression of pure bafflement. This was not in his script. Old Margaret was supposed to take the folder and shuffle out. "I think," I said when I reached the podium, "that there are a few things I'd like to say before we proceed." My voice was different, not louder. Different. It was my real voice, not the softened, uncertain voice I'd been using for 3 weeks. The voice that had addressed shareholders and testified before regulatory committees, and once, memorably, told a major client to take their contract elsewhere rather than compromise my company's ethics. Leo blinked. "Margaret, this isn't," he started. "Leo." I said his name in a way that stopped him completely. "Please sit down." He didn't sit down, but he stopped talking, which was enough. I opened the envelope, and I removed a single sheet of paper, which I set on the podium. Then I reached back into my bag, and I removed my actual identification. My real credentials. My company identification card. The one that read Martha Calloway, founder and chief executive officer. I held it up. The room was so quiet I could hear the HVAC system. "My name is not Margaret Collins," I said. "My name is Martha Calloway. I founded this company in 1987. I have owned it for 38 years. Every paycheck in this building originates from my signature." I looked around the room slowly, making contact. "I have been working in this office for 3 weeks as part of an internal investigation into reports of toxic management, ethical violations, and systematic workplace harassment, including age-based discrimination." The silence had a texture now. It was the silence of 43 people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the last 3 weeks. I looked at Leo. He had gone very still. The folder with my release of service was still in his hand. His face had moved through several stages: confusion, disbelief, a flash of something that looked almost like the beginning of bluster, and had settled, finally, on a kind of pale, suspended shock. "Leo," I said, "you have, over the course of my time in this office, addressed an employee by her approximate age, rather than her name on 14 documented occasions. You have assigned tasks to employees that were designed to humiliate, rather than serve any operational purpose. I have specific instances for each of those, with dates and witnesses. You publicly misrepresented a colleague's work in today's presentation. You removed your shoe in a professional environment and instructed an employee to clean it." I picked up my notebook from the podium. I'd placed it there while he was talking, and I set it down with a quiet, deliberate sound. "I have documented everything, with dates, times, and the names of every person present." Leo's mouth opened. I didn't. You can't just..." "Leo." I said his name again with the same quality as before, and again he stopped. "I'm not finished." I turned back to the room. "I want to be very clear to everyone in this room about something. The behavior I have witnessed over the last 3 weeks does not reflect the values of this company. It does not reflect what I built, or what I have spent 38 years protecting. Every person in this room has inherent dignity. Your age is not a liability. Your experience is not obsolete. Your worth is not contingent on whether someone like Leo finds you impressive." I saw Diane W. put her hand over her mouth. I saw Robert, 9-year Robert, very carefully look at the table and then look up at the ceiling. and I could see him working to hold his face together. To those of you who have endured what you've endured in this office and continued to come to work and do your jobs with professionalism and integrity. I paused. I see you. I want you to know that I see you. I looked back at Leo. He had found a kind of desperate defiance. His chin had come up. My father, your father, is currently in a meeting with our chief legal officer in the Cincinnati Marriott, I said. He became aware of this investigation 45 minutes ago. The chin came down. Leo Hargrove, effective immediately, your employment with Calloway Logistics is terminated. I kept my voice level, steady, not angry. I had processed the anger weeks ago, alone in a hotel room, and what remained now was simply clarity. You will be escorted from the building within the next 20 minutes. HR will contact you regarding the formal separation process and the matters that will be referred to our legal team for further review. I looked at him for one last moment. He was 25 years old, and he was standing at the front of a room full of people he'd humiliated, holding a folder with a termination document meant for me. And he finally, looked like someone who understood that the ground beneath him was not solid after all. I felt no satisfaction exactly, but I felt something, the particular rightness of a thing restored to its proper order. You may leave, I said. He left. Marcus, my head of security, who had been waiting in the lobby since the meeting started. Yes, he'd flown in. No, I hadn't told him to stay home. Escorted Leo Hargrove from the building at 10:47 on a Thursday morning. What happened in the conference room in the minutes after Leo walked out is something I find difficult to describe because it was so genuinely human that any description feels inadequate. People were quiet for a long time. And then Priya, careful, watchful Priya, who had squeezed my arm on the first day and looked at me with that unreadable expression, started to cry. Quietly at first, and then less quietly, and then the woman next to her put an arm around her, and then the whole room seemed to exhale at once, this great collective release of something that had been held too long. Robert came up to me. He was a tall man, slightly stooped in the way of people who have spent years making themselves smaller, and he stood in front of me and he said, I've been here 9 years. I've never told anyone this, but I've been updating my resume for the last 4 months. I'm glad you didn't leave, I said. He looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded, once, and went back to his seat. I spent the rest of that day at the Cincinnati office, not as the undercover intern Margaret Collins, as myself. I met with people individually who asked to speak with me. I walked the floor. I sat in the kitchen and drank terrible coffee and talked with people about what they'd experienced and what they needed and what a better version of this office could look like. I took notes, real ones this time, operational ones, the kind that turn into action plans. Richard Hargrove resigned that afternoon, given the evidence of what he'd knowingly permitted his son to do, and the evidence that he had, on at least 3 occasions, actively covered for him. Resignation was the preferred alternative to what would otherwise have been a more formal and public separation. Over the following weeks, we launched a comprehensive review of every regional office, not just Cincinnati. We restructured our HR reporting systems so that concerns could be escalated directly, anonymously, and safely. We invested in management training that actually meant something. We promoted Priya, who turned out to have quietly been documenting some of Leo's behavior herself, to an interim management role while we conducted a proper search. Diane Double was given a formal commendation and a project leadership role she'd been qualified for, by the evidence of her personnel file, for at least 3 years. She sent me a letter afterward, a handwritten letter on good paper that I keep in my desk. Robert is still there, still doing exactly what he does. People ask me sometimes when I've told pieces of this story in private, whether I regret not revealing myself sooner, whether I should have intervened the moment I saw the first act of cruelty instead of enduring weeks of it. I've thought about this carefully, and I believe the answer is no. Not because the suffering of the people in that office was acceptable, or because those weeks of documentation were worth the personal cost of what I experienced, but because what I learned in those 3 weeks could not have been learned any other way. The patterns, the culture, the specific textures of how power was being abused, these things only become fully visible when you sit at the bottom of the hierarchy and watch them from there. Every report I could have received, every formal investigation, would have given me information. Being Margaret Collins gave me truth, and I think there's something in that worth holding on to. True power, real power, the kind built from nothing over decades. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need a corner office or a title on the door to exist. It exists in the quality of your work, in the way you treat people, in whether you show up for the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Leo had a title and a father and a suit that cost more than my first van, and he was, in every way that matters, small. I cleaned his shoe, and then I took everything. I think about my father sometimes when I think about this story, about those long roads, those long hours, the dignity he carried so quietly. I think he would have had something dry and understated to say about all of this. He was that kind of man. Something like, "Well, Martha, seems like it worked out." It seems like it did, Dad. Character is revealed by how you treat the people who can do nothing for you. Leo Hargrove treated a 65-year-old woman as though she were invisible and irrelevant and beneath his notice. He saw someone he'd already decided didn't matter, and he acted accordingly, all the way to the moment the room went quiet, and I set my company ID on that podium. That decision, that judgment, that choice about who was worth basic dignity and who wasn't, that was the decision that ended his career. Not the shoe, not the public humiliation, not any specific incident. The accumulated, documented, witnessed pattern of a person who had never developed the one professional skill that no MBA program teaches. The understanding that how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter is, in fact, the only thing that ultimately does. I hope Leo learned something. I genuinely do. I don't carry what happened in Cincinnati as a trophy. I carry it as a reminder, to myself as much as to anyone, that vigilance is the price of the kind of culture I want to build. That I can't assume my values survive just because I have them. That I have to keep checking, keep showing up, keep being willing to sit in the uncomfortable chair and see what's true. I'm 65 years old. I have built something I'm proud of, and I'm not finished. Neither, I suspect, are you. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching justice find its way to the right people, then you're exactly who this channel is for. We tell these stories because they matter, because they remind us that endurance has value, that integrity compounds, and that the people who think they've won because they're loud are often one quiet reveal away from understanding how wrong they were. Subscribe to this channel. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories about people who held on, who kept their dignity, who waited for the right moment and then changed everything. You don't want to miss them. And if you have a story of your own, a moment of justice, a turning point, a time when someone underestimated you and lived to regret it, tell us in the comments. This community is built on those stories. Every single one of them matters. My name is Martha Calloway. I cleaned a 25-year-old boy's shoe, and then I fired him. Good night.